Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. Today, we're back with the authors of Death in Supernatural, talking about Death in Supernatural Part 2, because there was so much to talk about. And look, she's got the gorgeous cover there. Wow, almost like we planned it. Very, very nice. So we had such a great time talking about the topic last time, and there was so much to cover that we decided we had to come back and talk about it some more. But before we start, let's let my wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with you, Mandy.
Hi, I'm Mandy Taylor. I am currently an instructional designer at California State University, San Bernardino professionally. My academic interests vary, supernatural, most pop culture, zombies, other death-related things, science, all sorts of things, and English studies in general. It's Susan's fault that I got into Supernatural, and we talked about that last time, so I won't rehash it this time, but it's because of her.
Awesome. Lynn?
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I'm a professor at Westchester University. One of my research areas is in fan psychology, so I write a lot about the psychology of being a fan and why it is good and healthy. I am absolutely in love with Supernatural. 6 months after the finale, I am equally as in love with Supernatural as I ever was. My last 2 books were written with the cast of the show, with chapters by the actors and the fans about why Supernatural is awesome and how it's changed lives. Look, here's one of them. Oh, look, here's 2 of them. See, they have pretty covers too. Family Don't End with Blood, and There'll Be Peace When You Are Done.
Very nice. Susan?
Susan Nylander. I teach English at Barstow College, and I went to grad school with Mandy. I'm sorry for the dog in the background. She's
okay.
I do have my bribes, so I'll try, and she's out barking that way, but if she comes in here and starts barking, I do have the bribe. So, but the Bonster has been our mascot. Mandy, I'll tell you,
Yes.
there were times when we took off and went and stayed at a hotel for a weekend or a few days just to write and to edit, and the Bonster always came with us. So she's a bit of a mascot anyway. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so Supernatural, big fan, had to get Mandy into it. And just like Lynn, I am still enamored by the show. That's what gets me on the treadmill every day right now. I'm currently at the end of season 5, but I'm watching one a day so that I can stay on the treadmill for that 42 minutes. And that's what's keeping me in. So it's the Supernatural workout for me every day. Mm-hmm. And, if that's what it takes to get me on the treadmill, that's what it takes.
Very good. Well, and I'm Gail Z. Martin, and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, near future post-apocalyptic stories and more. And as Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. But the thing that's true is that with all of my modern day series, they're all worlds that Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. Huge Supernatural fan. I was very honored to be able to write a chapter for There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. And that's why I'm here with the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. So picking up where we left off, because there's no shortage of things to talk about with Death in Supernatural. One of the things that it mentioned in the book was signaling death as a way to signal change in characters and the narrative. The whole idea of, we get comments like, are you sure Sammy came back 100% Sammy? Mm-hmm. Or seeing Dean when he comes back very changed after hell and purgatory. Let's dive in right there and start with you, Susan.
Oh, well, I think when we talk about the experiences that the guys have with death, because they certainly have a lot of experience with death, they tend to die a lot. And so one of our contributors talked about that as signaling narrative, that it changes their characters, that it shifts who they are, how they behave, and it tends to keep it a little bit fresh. And that might be part of it, is that the characters have gone through an experience, and so then they peel back the layers of that experience as time goes on. When we look at season 4, when Dean first gets back to hell, or back from hell, he's keeping a lot of that to himself until finally he has to admit that he remembers everything. But a big part of that is Dean kind of peeling back the layers of what hell has done to him. And I think when we get to the episode on the head of a pin, where he is supposed to torture Alistair, and Sam says he can't do it. Dean can't do it. He's not strong enough. Ever since he got back from hell, there's something wrong. And so I think that allows the characters to develop and grow by dealing with those experiences they've had. So whether it's near death or post-death experiences, I think the characters do that allows them some chance to grow and shift.
Yeah, usually in the real world, when we say that death changes you, we don't really mean your death.
Right. Right.
Lynn, what are your thoughts?
I'm just laughing because only on Supernatural is death often used as a way to just, change the narrative, mix it up a little bit. Well, how about if he dies and then comes back? Well, you can't do that with most shows, but Supernatural does that repeatedly with multiple characters, sends them to hell, kills them, sends them to the empty, brings them back, takes their soul, gives their soul back. I mean, it really is, one of the reasons it lasted 15 seasons is because it did have more freedom to play with those kind of tropes that most shows don't really get to play with. But the other thing I was thinking of when we're talking about death and kind of the fear that comes with, is somebody going to come back different or going to come back wrong? The other thing I love about Supernatural is it's just such an existential show. It really, in sometimes really subtle ways and sometimes really meta ways, goes after these really deep kind of psychological truths about humans. And one of those is, in our closest relationships, in all our relationships, but maybe especially in our closest relationships, we're constantly a little bit worried that that person is going to change, and that we're then not going to really know that person, and we're not going to have the same kind of intimacy with that person, and maybe that person is even not going to like us as much anymore. We kind of go through our lives with this existential dread that something like that is going to happen. And that happens in Supernatural from the beginning. I'm still watching season 1. I was last time we talked. I think we're up to episode 20 now. So we're 1 week at a time, we're moving through. And from the very beginning, one of the fears that we see is Dean's fear, especially that Sam has gone off to school, to college, and had this experience that he hasn't had. And that somehow that has changed Sam, and Sam is no longer the brother who he prided himself on knowing inside out. And that maybe that means that Sam is not going to want to be part of his family, that they're not going to be close like they were, that Sam's going to up and leave him and go back to the normal life. So I think we see that in all the times that somebody dies, that existential dread that somehow the person is going to be fundamentally changed, and that's going to change our relationship with them.
Mandy?
Yeah, they've said a lot of what I was thinking as well, but this idea, to piggyback off of Lynn, if Sam has changed from the person Dean thought he was, that's a metaphorical death in some sense. It's that change of a relationship that we now have to renegotiate. And so Dean can't be who he thought he was in relation to the Sam that he knew at some point. So that's a constant reinvention. And we as viewers also have to make that adjustment. It's like, but Sam was like this, and but Dean, oh, okay, so we have to readjust. And accordingly, too, along those lines with the death and friendship is an anticipatory grief of losing that relationship, of siblings, of family, of friends, working on a different project that talks about grief in some fashion. But this idea of, in any relationship, in a close relationship, there's always that sense of, at some point, I'm going to have to say goodbye, whether it's through a literal death, somebody has passed on, or that the friendship or the family relationship dissolves somehow. So at every level, we're working with death in Supernatural. It's not just watching people die, it's watching relationships break or reform or transform, and then having to say, wait, but it was like this last season, so how come you're like this now? And there is that path that changed somehow. It's like, oh, Sam came back without a soul in season 6. How does that now change how he relates to everybody? It's actually one of my favorite seasons because of that, because you get to see the difference in that personality. I would still kind of love to see Soulless Sam versus Demon Dean somehow to see how that would work. I've been kind of looking for good fan fiction to see that mashup. I haven't really found any, but I haven't totally been looking, but I guess I might have to write some at some point too.
There's a whole
But
subset.
oh, good. I will.
Point you in some directions.
Awesome. Thank you. I still might write some anyway, but that's a matchup I've wanted to see somehow, because there has to be a difference in how that relationship is negotiated, because Dean with the demon is sold, but SOULED, he's soul and sold, but versus Soulless Sam, how does a demon soul compare to somebody without that soul, which is on both levels is a death of some sort. It's the death of who they were, and how to negotiate that. And those relationships have to change. And so then do ours with them as we watch.
Jody kind of brings this up explicitly in the Asa Fox episode, because she points out that, here's Mary back from the dead, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. But she tells Dean, this is huge, this is big. And she says, as much as I would love my family back again, what if I've changed? What if I've changed and they don't know me as I was? And so, she really recognizes that path that Dean and Sam and their mom is on, and how scary it can be. And so, she gets very explicit about that. And how do you negotiate those changes? And it can be pretty scary.
And like Mandy pointed out, I hadn't really thought of it this way, but it's so true. There's always a parallel with our relationship with the fictional characters as fans. And you bring up the Mary relationship. That was a change in relationship that a lot of fans could not negotiate successfully, including me. I don't feel like I ever negotiated that change successfully, to go from Mary, the idealized kind of beloved mother figure, saving her sons in home, to Mary, the traumatized adult woman confronted with 2 adult sons who she doesn't know, trying to figure out who she is. So, I mean, we, the audience, was sort of playing out that existential dread that someone who we care about is going to change in a way that's either not going to allow them to love us, or is not going to allow us to love them.
It's interesting. The way you put that made me think of something for the first time with Mary, and that is that it's almost like that moment when, as an adult, you see your parents as people out of the role of parent. And so, yes, Mary was a traumatized adult, getting to know her adult children for the first time, which is something that happens to all of us if our parents live long enough, that we see them as scarred and wounded and imperfect people who happen to be our parents. And if we're lucky, they can see us in the same way, and we can renegotiate some new relationship. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't.
And I took care of my parents. They were both ended up on hospice. So I took care of them to the end. And that relationship of becoming the parent, becoming the caregiver, is life transforming, and the hardest thing that I've ever had to go through, and hopefully will never have to go through anything that difficult again, but it's very life-changing, and it's like the end of, or it's a new death. It's a death of, my mother had dementia, so I was in a very long, prolonged period of grief while she was still here. And I was watching her death in slow motion, and it was like Regarding Dean, that episode hit me so hard because it was exactly like that, watching someone die in slow motion. And so to go through that, and then yes, to see your parents as fragile and frail when you're a kid, they're Superman and Wonder Woman, and they're great, and they can do no wrong, and they know everything. And then you get to a place where you realize, hey, they're just people. They're just human beings. And that is a little bit of a death of our childhood, I think.
Well, Sam even says that in Regarding Dean, that he'd seen Dean die many times, and this was worse.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the Mary point, there's a conversation Sam has with someone who says, yeah, my mother died when I was very young. And she says, oh, I'm very sorry. And he says, no, it's okay. I met her later in life and we got along okay. Which only happens on Supernatural.
Only on Supernatural could that happen.
Yep.
Now, in classical literature, there's the whole idea of catabasis and the journey through the underworld, and that's part of the hero's journey to take that journey through the underworld and come out changed on the other side. It's just another Thursday night on Supernatural. What about that idea of journeying through various underworlds and how that what you encounter there, what you see, what parts of yourself you run into, how does that relate to the hero's journey in Supernatural? Mandy?
Good question. First of all, to buy some time to think, but I also think different underworlds require us, excuse me, to find those different parts of ourselves, to kind of reach and see like, oh, I hadn't encountered that one aspect of myself, or I had buried that aspect of myself, or didn't realize I had that strength. To slightly digress into a personal example, my grandmother passed away last August, and I wasn't able to travel to the funeral, but I was in constant contact with my mother as much as I could be at the time. And my mother had the opportunity to prepare my grandmother for burial. And I had the opportunity to help prepare a friend much earlier than that. And my mother had never been through the process. So to kind of teach my mother how to prepare a body for burial, like you'll dress them as, through our religion, we have specific ceremonial clothing that is used for burial. It's like, you'll do this, you'll dress them this way, this goes this way. It's actually a very peaceful and spiritual experience if you allow it to be. It's also very hard and can be traumatizing as well. I mean, they go hand in hand sometimes. But to be in the position to teach my mother how to, one way to grieve her mother, then kind of made me confront, well, it could be another, hopefully 20, 25 years until I have to be in that position, but I'm gonna be. And so it's kind of just that, oh, I have to confront it through her again and realize that that is also coming. And some of my best friends are also much older than I am. And so like at some point, I'm gonna have to go through that same point too, maybe not as intimately as preparing bodies or anything like that, but that grieving process, yet another underworld. And we go through one every time we go through a loss, metaphorical or actual, the person passes away. And we always confront it differently because we're carrying those other losses with us to help experience this new one, but each one is distinct and individual. For example, I won't mourn my father the same way I mourn my mother, because we've had different relationships, even though we've been, they're different people. And we relate to each other differently, for bad pun. But I mean, so that, and that one way, so back to Supernatural with that, every time the boys die or confront death or go through that underworld, they are bringing baggage with them. Maybe some they'll leave behind because there's stuff you can't take with you from the underworld. You leave part of yourself as much as you bring out somehow. It's like there's always some part of you that's going to be back in that darkness that you then revisit for the next underworld. If I don't know if that's making any sense, but every journey carries the last journey with it. And so we can't help but find new avenues, or ideally draw on that strength that took us through that last one to negotiate this new path, which is at the same time familiar but unfamiliar because it's a new way and a new person. We have to grieve, even if we have the rituals like the pyres or the burials or the wakes. It's still different per person. And I'll stop now.
Okay, Lynn?
I think another thing that the show does that is, one of those underlying sort of themes in it, and a lot of science fiction touches on this, I think, because it is, again, a very human thing. We all sort of have this kind of fear of getting in touch with our shadow side, to get a little Jungian. We all feel like, oh, I've got a dark side and I'm afraid to really tap into it. Do I really want to know what's in my dark side? Maybe not. I think that's another kind of universal thing. It's something you see all the time when you do group therapy, that it's such a validating thing to help everybody understand that we all feel that way. And we are all terrified that we've got some secret, horrible darkness that is worse than everybody else's darkness. But the interesting thing about Supernatural is it makes a lot of this stuff explicit because it can do so in the realm of fantasy and science fiction. So Dean and Sam literally confront their shadow sides. Castiel also, all three of them repeatedly confront the dark sides of themselves embodied in, Leviathan Cass or Soulless Sam or Demon Dean or whatever it is, even, demon blood drinking Sam with the addiction metaphor. All of those are putting them in touch literally with their shadow sides. And I think every time that happens, they understand themselves a little bit better. I like to think that every time that happens, they are a little less afraid of the dark parts of themselves, and they can kind of harness some of that energy that comes from the dark side. There's that one episode where they have Dark Charlie. Charlie is literally split in two, which is like an old Star Trek episode that I'm thinking from the original show. But anyway, that's, I think, a really effective way whenever science fiction or fantasy uses that to show that you don't just want to cut your dark side off, because then you are missing some of the strength that comes from that dark side. But you also don't want to let it be out there unfettered, because then it can bring down the whole. You want to integrate them instead. So I like the way Supernatural explicitly lets them negotiate that.
Can I ask a question before?
Yeah, sure.
With that, it just made me comment/question. So how do we tie that then to Sam and his trial, the going through the trials? Because if he's confronted like his demon blood addiction and he hasn't partaken necessarily, but going through that the trials in season 8, he's being cleansed, and yet he is stopped right before the last thing, because otherwise he'll die. So how do we negotiate that change of Sam coming from dark side to through the trials, and that, nope, I can't let you be redeemed or saved because you're going to die?
I mean, I like to think that I've never thought about it before. It's a great question, Mandy, but I like to think that that's part of the same lesson. Like Sam was so focused on, I need to be cleansed. I've always had this darkness in me. I need to be cleansed. And Dean eventually saying, no, that's not the most important thing. You need to live. That's what you need to do. It's never been that way. I've never put anyone before you. I have always thought the best of you. You are not unclean. So I like to think that's also showing that same kind of thing, but also a great way to show the power of, even when Sam Winchester had already done so many heroic things, all he could think of was, I desperately need to be cleansed, and I need my brother's forgiveness because I've been so horrible that he doesn't care about me anymore.
That's
Sue?
that. Well, that scene when that you both allude to, when he tells Dean the trials are cleansing him, that they're purifying him. I about fell apart when the first time I saw that moment, because it's so touching when he's talking about himself as, you know, a 2 or 3 year old who senses something inside of him. And I thought, how horrific to be carrying that his whole life, and to have that as this burden that he's been carrying. And then the idea of, you know, it doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters anymore because these trials are purifying him. And yeah, I think, you know, you're right, that those are the things that he's wanted, that's been a burden his whole life. So yeah, it just, again, is a transformational piece, and Supernatural does transformation like nobody's business. So that was amazing. Yes, he doesn't get to complete the trial, the final trial, because Dean pulls him back from that. So that's almost like a near-death experience in a way, I suppose. And of course, then yeah, he's all wrecked inside, and you know, when we start season 9 with Ezekiel Gadriel, you know, again, that's a near-death experience for Sam.
Mm-hmm. And so much of it is going back to what Mandy said about how when you navigate the underworld, there are pieces of you that stay behind. There are things you leave. There are things you take with you. That whole idea of holding on and letting go, and what do you hold on to and what do you let go of, comes up just repeatedly in Supernatural, often along with the death and dying issues. Now, one of the things that happens as we go toward the later seasons is we have Death and Chuck kind of competing as being the biggest bad guys, but then we have the Empty, which is nothingness, which is almost, you know, which turns out to be worse. So from an existential standpoint, death, God, and nothingness, where does that factor in to all of this discussion of death? Mandy?
Oh, I would say ask Lynn first.
Okay,
But
Lynn? Give me a second to pull her thoughts together.
First of all, I want to say, though, that I think the late seasons treatment of God, death, and and the Empty was kind of all over the place, which makes it a little bit difficult to draw any conclusions. I think they couldn't quite decide what they wanted to do with any of those 3 entities. So pick an episode and you might get a different definition and characterization.
Yeah.
But I actually, you know, I think they originally conceived of the Empty and introduced it as a place that was almost restful, like you went there just to rest. It wasn't horrific. And then they switched gears to make it the worst possible thing. But as much as I don't like that they switched gears, and I think it's really distracting when they forget their own canon or change their canon in the middle of something, I kind of like the idea of the Empty as being sort of the worst fate that anyone can end up in, because again, just thinking with my psychologist brain, like there is nothing more awful to us as humans than feeling empty. We would rather feel anything than feel emptiness. You know, that empty feeling is what pushes people towards suicidality and towards self-harm and towards addiction. You know, it's just even the word, the empty, is a way of looking at something that's really horrible for humans. So I kind of like that it ended up being sort of the worst option.
I looked at those 3, you know, again, yes, God, death, and the Empty. What was interesting for me is looking at it from a feminist point of view, is suddenly you have these 3 ultra beings could have become, they could have flipped the script a little bit. And you had Billy, who took over for death, and then you had Meg, who was the personification of the Empty. So you have 3 women who are kind of overtaking those 3 men or 3 male positions in the universe. And then, of course, Amara gets subsumed by a male character, by Jack at the end. So it's like, and then Billy gets subsumed by the empty. So we don't really get to see how things could have flipped in that sense. I thought, wow, they're really going to destroy the patriarchy here, and then they didn't. So, but that's what I think of when I think of those three as the vying for power, is that suddenly they were female beings in a way.
Okay, Mandy?
So, yeah. So I saw, I also wanted more with Billy as death. I was a little miffed that they made her a big bad, gonna take over the world or wanting to take over the things. Because I thought there was more that could have been done with her. I wanted to see some of the development and the different things that her character seemed to promise as the new death. And it didn't go there, partly because I think we ran out of time, and that's fine. It was going to end at some point, but I just it was not the trajectory I was hoping for, or kind of expecting based on how we knew her as a Reaper. So I'm still a little torn about facing death, but I also think the empty for me made me think of Oblivion. By the time we got kind of the gear shifted, like Lynn talked about, the empty is like the worst place. It's Oblivion, or an outer darkness of some sort. Like there's nothing and nobody there, just that one entity standing guard. And if you wake up the empty, oh, nothing's gonna help you. Heaven can't help you, hell can't help you. I mean, there's no way to do that. Jack piercing the empty and calling forth people. I mean, Jack had the power to do so, so that was interesting that God couldn't do it, or wouldn't, but Jack could. And so there's something in that characterization, but calling forth names like Castiel, and Cass wakes up. The power of naming and kind of keeping that person or being alive of some sort by keeping that name alive, which is memory. And you're not fully gone until nobody can speak, until people don't speak your name anymore. If somebody remembers you, like in Coco, the movie, if somebody
say that I love the movie Coco.
Yeah.
You're talking about Coco. I love
Yes,
that movie.
yes, as long as somebody remembers who you are, you're never dead fully. I mean, interestingly though, the way you remember people, how did I just read it somewhere that the person who is gone can't defend their memory to you. It's like, I'm going to I'll talk about my mom again. She's still living, but when my mom passes, I'm going to remember my mother the way I remember her. She won't be able to say, no, that didn't happen that way. Or my siblings will remember her differently than I do, because we've had different experiences with her, kind of thing. And you can't say that my memory of my mother is wrong, so to speak, because she can't speak for herself. And so my memory becomes her, so to speak, and she remains mom as long as I remember her as mom in that capacity. And so Jack speaking Castiel back to life in the empty, and kind of angering the entity of the empty, was really powerful to me. And seeing that, yes, as long as somebody remembers and can speak your name, and then Cass fighting the empty to get back, and kind of thing, and fighting the oblivion of being in that place, is a hard fight, and a hard won fight, when Cass was able to get back to where he needed, or was needed, I guess. But then when he faced the empty willingly, that was a little different, and a little, I don't know the right adjective. Risky is the safe adjective, but maybe a little bit foolhardy, I think, is what I was looking for. It's like, wasn't always going to work out the way you wanted it to, but I'll face death willingly, because that's a Winchester thing. Winchesters and those around them are going to die or face death. How many times did Dean kill himself just to talk to death?
A couple.
I mean,
Weirdly, oddly.
Yeah. It's like,
Was
oh,
that
I
really yelling at the screen when he was doing that? What are you thinking?
yes, like,
Which
hello.
is the perfect setup for the next question, which is that throughout the series, we talk about the good death. The good death is heroic. It is dealing out vengeance, or it's dying with honor or sacrifice. It's going down swinging. You know, Dean talks about going out with his boots on or blaze of glory. And yet, when that exact thing happens in the last episode, there were a lot of people very upset that Dean went out exactly the way he always said he was going to. While Dean himself seemed to have peace with it. What do we do with this whole construct of a good death versus a bad death versus some deaths are heroic and some deaths are not worthy? What do we do with that? Susan?
Oh, I know, and I don't want to step on any landmines because I know that just and I'm only on the periphery of fandom, but you know, some of the things I've seen, people really, really had a hard time with that. And I think Lynn's write-up really helped me, you know, make complete sense of it. I thought, yeah, that's the death that, you know, Dean says, well, I didn't think it was today, but he knew it was coming. It was like, okay. And he was ready to go. Sam got the death that Dean wanted for him. Dean said, you know, I want you to, you know, essentially to die in bed, you know, and Dean got the death that he expected for himself. So, but I know that a lot of people were taken aback. I felt better. I wish they'd made it much more explicit in the episode, that it had not just happened like the week before, you know, that they'd had some time living this normal life. I felt so much better about it when I think, Lynn, you said it was supposed to be about 5 years or so. We're having this. I'm sorry, what?
Can't hear you, Lynn.
We can't hear you, Lynn.
You can't hear me at all?
Oh,
Now we can.
Oh, I was going to say somewhere between 6 months and 5 years, but definitely was not like the next week.
Okay, yeah, I know I felt much better about it knowing that, but it wasn't made very explicit. And I think that, you know, I talk about it in my chapter a lot about masculine, the sacrificial death, you know, that all three, you know, John dies a sacrificial death, Dean and Sam, they all do this sacrificial thing, dying with their boots on, dying on their feet, you know, and that was, it's such an American mythos, you know, or it's just such a big part of what our culture expects men to, you know, to do. And so, so I think, yeah, and Dean was still, yes, he was on his feet, literally. And I think that I don't have a problem with it, but I know a lot of people did. So
I think one of the things that struck me with it is it really kind of went back to the randomness of life and death. You know, you read these articles about somebody who survives 3 tours of duty in a war zone and comes home and gets hit by a drunk driver, or somebody who gets through 4 bouts of cancer and then slips in the shower and dies. And it takes away, we want to make everything mean something and be very rational, and it isn't. And that's what I got from Dean's death, was that could have been any Tuesday.
Yeah.
right.
And I think it was disquieting in that way because we wanted it to be something different. Go ahead.
But I love that it was that, because I think that really underlined the fact that even when Chuck was pulling some strings, they lived an unbelievably dangerous life. That was part of what made the series so compelling every single week, is because you did believe, and you needed to believe, no matter how many times they were resurrected, you needed to believe that any random vampire hunt in a barn at night, saving 2 little kids could lead to one of them dying. That was what the show was all about. That's why Sam and Dean are heroes, because they knew that every single time they got in that car and went off to do something to save people that they didn't even know, they knew that that could be the day that they could die. And I love that part of it. I understand, you know, I think that people, in some sense, people were never going to be happy about Dean Winchester dying. I mean, none of us were happy about Dean Winchester dying. I didn't want him to die ever. I'd like him to, he's a fictional character. He can live forever as far as I'm concerned. He should never have to die. So I think some of the upset is mixed in with that. People latched onto the way it happened when really a lot of it is just normal grief for this fictional character that we didn't want to go away. That was, you know, that was Jensen's initial problem with it, that he just had a hard time thinking about Dean dying. He loves Dean just like we love Dean. So it took him a while to get his head around the fact that this is where the story is headed. This is where it should be headed. I still don't like it. I still don't want him to die. I love him. So I think a lot of people's feelings got mixed in with that. But it was certainly a heroic death, as honestly, most deaths are heroic, like facing dying, no matter what your circumstances are. You don't have to be saving the world doing it. It's a heroic thing to go in and accept your death, and, you know, to attempt to pass some message on to people who are important to you. I thought it was incredibly well done, and just very moving in a way that, you know, made me cry so hard I almost threw up, but also just felt very organic and right for the character and for the show.
Oh, and in a way, Sam's death carrying on for another 30 some years without Dean, when we know that he didn't do well without Dean, was heroic too, because he lived instead of cutting it short and meeting Dean early. And there's some heroism and definitely a good death in that he ran the course to the end. Mandy?
I was just thinking too, Dean's death in the finale harkened back a little bit to Faith, when Dean was first, that first time we see him, he's electrocuted and he's dead for all intents and purposes, or he's on the brink of death already. And it's one of those first times where it's like, oh, dude, you can't die yet. It's way too early for something to happen to you. But he was already accepting of the fact that was going to be his end. Like, this is it. And it's only because Sam found the way through those supernatural means that it didn't end, halfway through season 1, so to speak. So, I mean, and for it to carry that long and to take us for 15 years through all of the different ways that they could have died, should have died, did die, to finally see that full acceptance from both Sam and Dean, had me also crying almost hard enough to throw up also. I think I had to pause and wait, and I like, nope, okay. And I was crying for the rest of the episode, the second time through as well. I think the third time through also. I haven't done a fourth, so I don't know yet. But and then to still grieve those characters that are also mine, as much as they are everybody else's, they're mine. So I don't know, it's I see the objections to the death as well. I see that too, but I told Susan I was very gutted but satisfied with the ending. Like, it worked for me. Like, I understood what was happening and that there were limitations based on what was happening at the time, but they did what they could do, and I don't know that they could have done anything other than having more people to kind of say last goodbyes, so to speak, or to have a reunion in heaven that we may have wanted to see. But it was ultimately Sam and Dean's story, and it needed to end with them. And we got there. Whether or not we liked how we got there, that's how we ended. And again, the very end, including fans, like, it's because of you. That last moment on the bridge was that acknowledgement, like, we've been here with you and you've been here with us. And that got me again at the end. It's like, I was fine until you said that.
Well, and to end kind of on a high note, there's a deleted scene that was released where we see Sam and Dean in the car, and I think it gives credence to the idea that it's somewhere between 6 months and 5 years between episode 19 and episode 20, where they're debating whether or not Sam found a good enough doggy daycare for Miracle, and to have the time to do the research, and that they have discussed taking him out on cases, plural, and decided not to do that. Obviously, time has elapsed, aside from the cuteness of Dean, being upset about the quality of doggy daycare. To me, I saw that passage of time confirmation, and that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I don't know how they meant it, but that's what I'm reading from it.
No, I think they definitely meant it, but I think they could have done a better job of making that really clear. I mean,
Yeah.
that scene was edited out, and that if we'd had more of those scenes, I think it would have been, it was written in the original, the script draft or whatever you call those preliminary things, 6 months or something. And then, so it was at least 6 months. We know that. It might have been longer, but it just didn't come clear because the montage just went by so fast that we were like, oh, okay, well, that was 48 hours or whatever. So, editing decisions are tough, and sometimes maybe not the exact right one gets made.
Well, folks, go ahead.
I was just going to say, with that clip, the only thing that really bothers me is I want to know what song they were going to put in there that Sam reacts to. I want to know what that song was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Well, folks, we are at the end of our time again. So let's go around and let everybody know where they can find you on social media. And Mandy, let's start with you.
So right now, it's Instagram at Elaisona, ELAISONA. That's also my handle on Twitter. I'm currently off Facebook at the moment.
Okay, Lynn?
You can find me on all social media at FangasmSPN, and I blog at fangasmthebook.com, and I also have a blog on Psychology Today.
And Susan?
On Twitter, I'm Suze, SOOZE 105. And that's pretty much it. I don't spend a lot of time on social media and the public part of things. So, but I'm also happy to get emails. And we still have the Death and Supernatural at gmail.com available if people have questions.
Okay. And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. All the rest of the social media is some variation of those. So start with those and you'll find me. And of course, I'm usually here on Continual. So thank you so much for coming back to round out the discussion. I have this feeling we could keep going on this forever, but it was great to get a chance to come back and do at least a little bit more on a big topic. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up here on Continual. So we'll see you online.